share a little bit about your writing process when you sit down to write something, anything for that matter. Could be poetry, could be a book, could be an essay. How does it begin?
So usually I've noticed that when I want to, I feel the idea of a poem coming on, I tend to attempt the first draft by hand. So I let myself, I think I'm most primal when I'm writing a poem, and I like to begin in a notebook. And then once I feel like I've, done um, a couple of playful versions of that, then I kind of transfer it to my laptop. And then it becomes a little bit more of a serious edit. You know what I mean?
For an artist, the minute you become comfortable is the minute you're no longer searching for your truth. If you're not throwing away some of your work, you're not evolving as an artist.
Look for the silver lining whenever a cloud appears in the blue.
Eggs for breakfast, just nameless eggs, with untamed yolks flailing into what could be butter but isn't. Teethed by an upend smile, screaming into what could be sky but isn't. Precocious and perfectionist, moody but self modifying, severe yet silly. My guest, Dipti Anand, is many things, but if you will ask her who she is, the most direct answer you will receive is poet and writer. Hello and welcome to another episode of Between Us, a very, very special episode coming from Delhi, in conversation with Dipti Anand. So, precocious and perfectionist, moody but self modifying. How would you say you are? Are you all of them?
I think so. I would say that, especially in this time of multiple choices, it's harder to choose. So I always feel like there's a and but to how one tends to describe themselves. So I
Okay.
find it's easier to understand myself on a spectrum, and sometimes those spectrums can be opposing.
So, Dipti, first of all, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure. Let's begin from the beginning. So, you were born and raised in Delhi?
I actually wasn't. I was born in Kerala.
Mm-hmm.
My parents, because of my dad's business, we had a base in the north and in the south. So they happened to be living in the south at that time, and that's where I was born. And then shortly after, we moved to Singapore for a few years. Then we moved back to Kerala. Then from Kerala, we moved to Chandigarh. Then from Chandigarh, we moved to Delhi. And then once I got to Delhi, I had I think it was my seventh birthday. And then I was here till I left for the US.
So, do you have memories of the first 7 years? The
Um,
places, the people?
People, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Places as well. I actually was able to visit my family home in Kochi just last year after a really long time. And it was a very surreal experience because a lot of things have been kept the way that they were. Things like my grandfather's room, my grandmom's room, my childhood room, where my parents used to stay. Um, and things definitely came flooding back, though, of course, it's attached to a lot of vagueness. It's more emotional, I would say. And I think that helps fill in the blanks.
You turned 7 when you were in Delhi, right? You were
Hmm.
7 years old. When did, and based on whatever I've read up, whatever material I got, um, I believe you started writing at a very, very early age,
I
right?
did. Yeah. I was
Uh,
9.
you were 9, right? What led to it? I mean,
I think that I was always someone who felt a lot. And I don't know, maybe, at home we were always encouraged to read, and words were always a part of, our experience. My parents also have their own versions of what they like to read. And in general, we're quite a conversational household like that. Um, so I feel like maybe it was probably reading that helped me sort of jump into the other side of things. Um, but I kind of started writing because I felt I had something to say. And I think a theme that has sort of continued on for many years has been just sort of reflecting on my own existence. And not to, make it sound so narcissistic in that sense, but um,
All artists are. This
I
is
mean,
fine.
I know, and also I know that narcissism is also, I'm using it very loosely. There's so many attachments to the words. I'm using it in the most colloquial way, but um, I think that subjectivity was always of interest to me. Of course, I didn't define it like that at that time. I was just writing how I felt. And in fact, something I'll share is that the first poem I ever wrote was called Smile, and it was an A-B rhyme scheme. I remember I was really into rhyming back then. I don't like to rhyme so much anymore. And yeah, it was. It just, I don't know where it came from, but it just, to me, it was a very potent emotion that just found multiple metaphors.
So, you said you had a lot to say. What did a 9-year-old have so much to say?
Like
What?
I'm saying that um, the experience of, I guess, I mean, you don't, like I'm saying, you don't necessarily have the right words at that time to even, explain yourself and your feelings, but you know that, observations are being made. You can sense what it means like to be heavy or to feel light in response to things, but you don't have the right words for it necessarily. Like I remember I wrote another poem about, like, I think it was shortly after, it was called Salty Cappuccino. I had never had a coffee in my life. I don't know where, maybe I liked the cadence of the word cappuccino, or I was fascinated about it being something that was out of my reach. Like if I have to go back and think, go back and read that poem and think about what I must have been feeling. I think maybe at that time I was just maybe I was fascinated with things that were out of my reach or I didn't understand. And I attached a lot of unexpected meaning to them, you know?
Interesting. Because my own experience of writing started because I refused to go out as a kid. I think I think until I was 12 years, and my parents were worried that this guy doesn't go out to play, doesn't interact. So my parents decided the best way to probably make me reach out to the world was to start journaling, start reading. And as I started doing that, uh, there came a point in time when I went up to my parents and said, okay, I want to know more about this place. And they said the best way to do that is to get out of the house, start meeting people, start learning. So for me, it was more of a form of expression. While growing up, were you introverted in that sense, or was it that you didn't have too many friends, or what? How did that happen? I mean, how does a 9-year-old decide to just write?
It's interesting. What you're saying is that for you, it was a way to kind of be more into the world. And for me, it was a way to step away from it. Because I always had, I mean, I was really lucky. I've always, had a very full life and always been surrounded by a lot of great people and always had a lot of friends. Um, and that's not necessarily, it can get overwhelming for me. And I think that's something that if I have to look back at my life, it's something that I must have experienced from as long as I can remember. And I think it just maybe became a space where I could engage in expression, because I think expression is at the heart of it. But in a way where I was able to find a space or create a space to engage more deeply with myself. And I recognize that that's something that I still hold important, you know?
What did you read growing up, especially through your school life?
I used to read, I used to try reading things that were a little bit ahead of my time. Like I tried reading Victor Hugo at some point and I couldn't like
Right through
get
your
through
school
it.
days? I mean,
When I think I must have been like, I don't know when I got it. Maybe I was in the ninth grade or 10th grade,
middle school, yeah.
but it was, I mean, to be honest, I couldn't get through it. It just, everything washed over me in a way where suddenly I was like, okay, I don't like this feeling of being intimidated by something that I love. But I read a lot of stuff that I think a lot of kids ended up reading when we were growing up. I read Harry Potter. I used to love Sweet Valley. Um, I think I read them from middle school all the way to high school. Like, I used to love Mallory Towers. Those were a
Hmm.
lot of the I think those were the children's books that I really gravitated towards.
You read now too, right?
Hmm.
Did you have a reading process?
In what sense?
Well, right from my growing up days when I used to read, I would always have a notebook next to me when I'm reading anything. And I started reading a lot about history, science growing up. I would always make a little bit of notes. And whether it's a self-help book, whether it's a novel, I would always make a little bit of notes. So my reading process is I would read a book 2 or 3 times. The first time was more to just make my notes about, something which I feel interesting. Then I would go back and read the notes and then go back and reread the book. And the third time would be the notes and the book itself and form it. So there was just a process for me, which was something because I think I was a slow reader and a learner as I was growing up. And so maybe I made that as a process for me to understand, for me to absorb what I was reading. Um, and I think after a certain point in time, I realized that I also need to read for fun and then not just make my notes. So do you have something like that when you read, or is it just open a book and just go with the flow?
I mean, I'm really jealous that you're a note taker because it's something that I would love to like create from like as a practice, but I don't know. I think I resist it because I am someone who likes to go with the flow when I'm reading something. In terms of a process, I guess I like to read multiple things at the same time,
Yes.
like different genres, because honestly, what I tend to read can be quite heavy.
Hmm.
So if I'm reading something that's like a very intense philosophical sort of book, it's not the kind of book you're going to sit and read cover to cover. I'll read a chapter, let it go for a few weeks, and then kind of just see whether that stuff is, if I'm resonating with it, if I'm able to recall. And I feel like for me, recall is associated so much with understanding. Um, that if I'm just not able to if I finish reading it and I can't tell you what the chapter was about a couple of days later, I feel like, okay, I have to go back and read it again. So that sort of, for me, makes me understand what dictates my rereading process, I guess. But in general, I'm not someone who rereads a lot of books. Um, I don't know. I just feel like there's so many books to read, and my list is just so long. I think I just don't end up rereading them.
It's interesting because what I sometimes do is I read something and it leaves a mark on me, and I go back to read that book 3 years down the line just to see. And the books which I have shortlisted, those in that particular order, somehow I feel that I see those books very differently 3 years down the line.
Mm-hmm.
One of the books which profoundly affected the way I conduct my own life, and it's really a shame, I would say, but I read that book during COVID, was The 5 a.m. Club by Robin Sharma. And it was a very, very, and I've heard so much about him, but I've never wanted to read him. And when I started reading the 5 a.m. Club, somewhere because I also write,
Mm-hmm.
there was always a conflict within me as a reader and a writer. You read and write. Are there some tips which the reader Dipti Anand gives to the writer Dipti Anand when she writes?
They do say that it's always a good exercise to read the genre you're writing in. But I feel like, it's like one of those things where you're like, drink more water, like it's good. Like it's good advice in general. But I feel that to when you're writing, if you're writing, let's say, a science fiction story, maybe you don't need to read other science fiction stories. Maybe you need to read more science, at that point in time. So
But as a reader, when
Yeah.
you read a book of another author, do you also sometimes feel, I wish this probably would have been written differently? The writer, would have probably addressed this differently. Do you have that?
No, I feel like I suspend my belief, and I I'm happy to go along with it. And then I'm happy to also know at the end whether I felt satisfied or not with that journey. So I give myself that space. And um I mean, everybody writes so differently. And I think that's the thing that I really enjoy interacting with is how this person chose to tell that story. And knowing that, for example, if I had written a story about a character similar to that, that the details I would have focused on would have been entirely different, because the details that concern me may not be the details that concern that writer.
But that thought does come in when you're reading?
No,
No.
no.
That's interesting, because those thoughts do come
I
into
mean,
me. I think that's where
I tossed the editor side of me off at that point, and
true.
yeah.
So writing at 9 and then growing up, the process continued, the style changed.
Style changed, for sure, and also I think the relationship with writing changed, because I think throughout till I went to college, I think in college then suddenly maybe it was the level of what I was learning changed in a good way. Things became so much more intellectual and engaging. And also, I was finally in a space where I was being able to focus on the arts. I didn't get so much of an opportunity to do that in school while I was here.
Hmm.
And, all of that was a very natural alignment for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at that time, then I was very stimulated. So I was writing, but I was writing in my writing classes. I wasn't writing so much outside of that. And I was just, I think, consuming a lot of information, experiences, culture.
Mm-hmm. And when you say college, that's the Babson College?
Babson, and then when I was at NYU as well. So both my programs have had, I mean, they've been interdisciplinary, but I've always pursued writing within them. And
So can you talk me through the whole experience at Babson?
yeah, I mean, it's a business school, and but it's a school that is very well celebrated for its entrepreneurship program. And the reason why that is important is because it inculcates a culture that's very creative. So the energy is very creative. People are finding ways to discover their passions. And then, of course, for many people, they kind of went on to articulate that in the shape and form of a business. But so many people I went to college with also went on a very creative path. So it was more about like a mindset that you were engaging in and cultivating in
Isn't that a
yourself.
very interesting combination? Being creative, being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, it is.
It's
There's a lot to learn from both sides.
Both
That's
sides.
why I never felt restricted. Now, there was a certain period of time where I had to take business classes. I had studied commerce in school, so it wasn't unfamiliar to me. But very quickly, I also got the opportunity to sort of choose all my art classes as well, my
that's
humanities
interesting.
classes. So, I mean, from my freshman year onwards, I was always very mindful of what humanities classes I was doing. And then when I reached my junior year, and that's the time where we sort of had to pick concentrations, and mostly people around me were like, okay, like finance and strategy and those types of things. I was like, okay, I'm going to do entrepreneurship and I'm going to do literary and visual arts. So in a way, it was really kind of a blessing to make that choice in a space where many people were not. Because I developed very close relationships with the department, with my professors, because, they were so excited to have someone also feel as passionately about these things as they
Yeah,
were.
because that's a very, very odd combination, isn't it?
But they fed off of each other. And like I said, from my entrepreneurship classes, I learned I learned versions of strategy, or like how to sort of think ahead, or how to identify connections or gaps between things. And I think in a larger sense, that groomed me really well for being able to wear multiple hats in the future.
NYU.
Yeah.
How did that transition happen?
So I knew I knew that I wanted to do my master's immediately after my undergrad. So
No gap year.
I didn't take a gap year. I did take 6 months because I decided to give myself a 6-month break. So I went in the winter of 2013, I think it was. And it was an interdisciplinary arts program, and I studied a bunch of things. You could sort of, it was very elective based, sort of. You could, pick whatever you wanted. So I studied some contemporary art. I studied literary theory, philosophy, some complete classes, writing classes. So it was like you could sort of construct your own curriculum within the graduate school.
That's really, really cool.
As a part of a larger program, of course. I think they've now, since I've been, they've changed the name to, I think it's the Center of Experimental Humanities or Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement. It's a program within the larger graduate
So
school.
you also had behavioral science?
No, but for
okay.
example, some of my friends were taking like gender studies classes and things as well. So
That is so cool.
there were options. It was, and people were sort of trying to focus on the lenses that matter to them. So for example, if someone was studying gender studies and complet, they'd go ahead and do something else with that. In that vein, a lot of people went on to do their PhDs, which is still a looming desire for me.
I was about to ask you. So master's and then PhD.
I would love to, or another master's. I mean, I like the idea of studying.
Do you feel people who want to pursue writing as a full-time profession or as a career, they could probably follow the same process you followed? Or do you think they should probably just, because there are so many writers who probably haven't taken arts and humanities and they've just gone on to become authors and writers, but someone who truly wants to feel writing from within, do you think the career path you chose would be a good one for them?
I think it's hard to say that, I don't think one size fits all.
Yeah, but you must have thought through before you pursued this whole thing, or was it just let me do this first and then I'll see how things move?
So one of the moments that a pivotal moment for me was when I realized that writing was not something I just did. It wasn't a hobby. It was who I was. And that also came around when I was in college.
Could you explain that a little more, who I was?
So I think that when I was younger, it was, Dipti writes, or I write, or it was just, something, it felt like a hobby, someone else was at that time, learning to play a sport. I was choosing that time to, write an essay and enter into like school competition or something like that. So it felt like an extracurricular activity. And I'm glad I didn't take it that seriously at that point because I wasn't obsessed with what it all meant. It was just fun to do. And it felt very natural. And then later on in college, I think that's also a time where you start to think about, how does all of this make sense? What am I going to do? What is my purpose? And I think for a while I didn't imagine myself to be, or I used to feel hesitant to embrace this title of a writer because I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't know. It always felt sort of out of reach, and it felt like I would just sort of have to go and like live on my own and not really be cut off from circulation. And that was the young version of me who had like these faceless authors and just their words, and then sort of making up these stories about them and them feeling so out of reach. And but I mean, I quickly realized that was really wrong because contemporary writers are so plugged in to what life is, and in the cultural circulation, and they're responding to the world, they're living in the world, they're experiencing it, but they're finding ways to do that in their own ways. So I think that moment, I realized that there was a way for me to be a writer that was my way of being that writer, and it could be who I am.
Do you feel this? I sometimes feel the contemporary writers are more reactive and responsive rather than trying to create a world. I mean, it's more like there is this world, and how do we respond to the things happening around it? It's just, I always felt that there is less of creation and more of how do we plug ourselves into it.
You mean like finding something very topical to write about?
Yes.
I think it might be genre based, in my opinion. Like if it, and I am very passionate and what's the word? I do play favorites sometimes because I love the literary genre, and that tends to be,
which is fine.
Which tends to be more focused on characters, and then it's a character driven plot in that sense, right? So the stories tend to feel a little bit more timeless because they're about the human condition at the end of it. If you have to think of really be reductive and find the couple of things that connect them all, those stories are very much about, someone will find something to relate to, the arc is such. But a lot of other genre fiction, it can depend. The way people are writing romance novels now is very different from how they were written back in the day, or the kind of romance novels my mom used to read. Now there will be very, very important and topical things that sort of construct or shape their construction
Yes.
of the story. So I think,
The Victorian era had letters and birds flying down,
yeah.
and now you have the swipes. So
Yeah, though I'm happy to that we're trying to move away from the Victorian hangover, because I think it's
are you a purist at heart when it comes to writing and when it comes to...
can anyone be, I don't know, can anyone be like a purist about anything in that sense? So what do you mean by purist exactly?
For the ease of understanding, I would say being very authentic when you write, not influenced by circumstances, not influenced by the period you are in. Sometimes you want to write something, and I think we live in a world today where we take offense to everything around us. So being able to write what I feel without really being actually without judging myself first, when I'm writing. So that for me is being a purist. Like the other day, as I just finished my first manuscript. And
Amazing.
yeah. And shared it with the publisher, and I got few notes and points from her. She said these things. So she marked a little bit of things for me, saying contemporary, notes for you, and stuff like that. And I realized that those notes were more from a perspective of be mindful of today, be mindful of how someone would feel, and all of that stuff. And I'm all fine with that. But when I'm writing something, it's come naturally from within me, and I'm not sure if that's something which you do follow, where... And I'm not talking about the commercial diktats of writing. I mean, you reach a stage where what you write as a 9-year-old and what you write as a author today is very different, because there are market forces which kind of come in. So when I say purist, is more of free flowing of your emotions coming through when you've written whatever you've written, and they are not dictated by how would XYZ react to these. I don't know if I've been able to make
No,
myself...
I get it. So thank you for explaining that. I think it's very, for me, I'm not sitting and visualizing my reader in that sense. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but I think when I'm working on something, it's very important for it just to be the work and me in that space. And I think if I start to think about anyone else, I'll start to overthink it, and then the authenticity will be lost. And I think that is the beauty of having time and the option of multiple drafts. I think that's the beauty of having an ecosystem where you have someone like an editor to discuss those things with, because it's an interesting time for the arts, where I feel like there is a lot of attention and excitement and a lot of very, very amazing things that are taking place now. And the audience just seems to be growing, in terms of, it's not just now niche. It's like I see it broadening in so many places.
And more people are into reading from a young age, right?
Reading and just visiting art and cultural places, and you see that, like, it's really, it's caught on in a way that I feel like even 10 years ago the pulse wasn't the same. And given that, there is a lot more of the back end that's sort of trying to also, keep up with everything. So even now, for example, there's 10 years ago, an author's platform didn't matter as much as it does today. And if people say that it doesn't matter, I think that, I'm not someone who thinks that it should matter, but I also kind of understand it, in terms of like the larger ecosystem that we're in, these if it's not necessarily an environment where even I feel artists would be satisfied if they were making things that eventually found no engagement. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not trying to, I know that could be like, I'm not trying to take away from the satisfaction one receives from creating something and from, um, producing it for the simple fact that it exists. I think there are projects that have that nature, but I don't think complete practices anymore fit into that. In that way, for me, my understanding is that times have
Can you
changed.
explain that last bit?
So when I'm writing, I don't necessarily like to focus on other people or even the world at large, I guess, even though the work itself is my writing tends to think about those larger questions. But when I say that, I mean I at that point kind of want to forget, that like um about anything else except me and the work. And the reason I say that is because you know I don't want to risk overthinking something, because at that moment you can chance to lose an authentic expression, you know and I think that a lot of people call that state by different terms. Some people will call it a flow state, but you're just sort of allowing things to come out. I'm also not someone who plots too much in advance. Again, it depends on the scale of the project. When I was working on my first book, I ended up um, creating a little bit of an outline, but I've seen other writers' outlines and they can be so much more detailed. So again, it's very much about your own personality and also being able to manage yourself. And I know that I'm someone who tends to be an overthinker. And
Explain to me that.
so if I start to move into a tangent, and let's say that tangent has a negative complexion to it, then I can tend to really sort of, start to, it'll be, scenario A will be a little bit better than scenario B, then scenario C, and then it'll just keep getting progressively worse, and then eventually I'll be like, why am I even writing this? So I don't want to allow myself to reach that point. I would rather give myself the space to say, even if it's bad, it's just me. Even if I decide to delete this work by tomorrow morning, I need to give myself the space for it to even come out. So in fact, I do have a lot of unfinished pieces from over time. And over like they're just in these innocuous folders on old hard drives, and I never threw them away for this reason, because at some level I feel like it's nice to kind of go back and read work that never really made it out of its own beginnings. And um sometimes it's a nice way to track how things have changed in terms of my writing style, or uh the things that I'm interested in writing about. And other times I think it's nice to sort of look at it and be like, it's okay that I didn't finish it.
Okay, I know some of them have not made out of the folder. Would it be possible for you to share something from one of those folders?
I would not be able to recall something verbatim like that.
No, that's okay.
No, I mean, I wrote like a very, I don't even know, maybe how to categorize. Maybe it was just a short story actually, but it was embarrassingly, very, uh, princess is saved by, I mean, again, I'm going back to like the early days. I must have been like 12 or something when I wrote this, about like a princess being saved by a prince. And it was very like, in the Arabian desert and like all of that. And I'm really glad I have that story. I'm really glad that I kept it. It's not something that I resonate with anymore, or would ever want to see the light of day, not for any other reason, but because it's just
You don't believe in princesses being saved by prince anymore?
no, I mean, of course, now we're going to talk about those contemporary plugs, and your thoughts do refine, and there's so many things that, of course, are problematic over time. But it's not even that. I think um, it's just maybe the writing, and I think maybe it was, um, it it's not, I wouldn't even say that it would be bad. It just feels like, it doesn't feel like me.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a story. It could be a good story, it could be a bad story, but it doesn't feel like my story. Do you know what I
It
mean?
doesn't feel like your story today, or when you wrote it when you were 12. At that
I was
point,
always a little bit of a romantic. So I think that that way it is like, it's not something that I wouldn't have resonated with or that, I don't want to associate with like that. But it's not something that um it feels like I'm writing a story for someone else in that
okay, I get
story.
that.
Yeah. You know?
Anything in recent times which has not gone out of your folder?
Mm, I think a couple of poems maybe
Mhm.
that I recently wrote that are still trying to find
Anything you want to share?
themselves.
Just a few lines?
Nothing that I would be able to remember, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
genuinely. If I could, I would have.
Okay. So things which are not coming out of your folder, things which have already come out. Share a little bit about your writing process when you sit down to write something, anything for that matter. Could be poetry, could be a book, could be an essay. How does it begin?
So usually I've noticed that when I want to, like, I feel the idea of a poem coming on, I tend to attempt the first draft by hand. So I let myself, I think I'm most primal when I'm writing a poem. And I like to begin in a notebook. And then once I feel like I've, done a couple of playful versions of that, then I kind of transfer it to my laptop. And then it becomes a little bit more of a serious edit. You know what I mean? Where I'm like, then I start to feel like that I've taken a step back from the poem. And now I'm looking at like, okay, would there be another word that would work better here? Versus when it's in the notebook phase, it's all about the feeling, trying to figure out what it is that I'm trying to capture, what it is that I'm trying to say. And yeah, like just, what the purpose of the poem
Do
is.
moments play a role when you start to write? Like, okay, now is I think this is the time to write. Or do those happen with you? Um, like when I started to write my book, it was more of a fact that my friend said, "You've been journaling all your life. Why don't you just put all your journals into a book?" And I'm like, "No, that's not. This is not about just making all my journals into a book. I need to really feel that." And I think that the whole phase of the pandemic, when we were all shut in some way, um, I felt this is the time for me to pick bits and pieces of my journal and you know write them into a book. But even when I started doing that, and I have the same process of writing down, it's a nightmare if you have to type them back. But what I wanted to ask was, like, for example, when you begin to write, is there a particular moment where you say, okay, now I'm ready to write? Probably it's in your mind for a while, but okay, I feel now I need to put pen into paper. Are there such experiences? Or is it like, I want to write, so I'll just write?
I think it's one of those marathon versus sprint sort of situations where it's not necessarily a moment, but it's about the muscle and stamina. So I feel like I end up, because I do spend a lot of time in my head, I start to kind of, that feeling does, emerge. And I don't know necessarily the right word to use, but for me, it often feels like some version of being over aroused, overwhelmed. There's a heightened sense of feeling. And at that point, I know um, that there is, like, if I so chose to write at that point in time, that it, some, like, I would be able to not only process it for myself, but something, like I'd be able to sort of connect it to a creative impulse that I'm having, and it would be a really good alignment for me to start working on a new piece, or to really be in the thick of it. um and sometimes it's even, sometimes I think of a word. I'm a big first line person. And sometimes if, a first line comes to me, then I keep thinking about it. Then I'm like, who said that? Who, or where did that line, like, what is this line trying to connect to? Where, if it's something to do with the weather, where is this particular moment of weather taking place? And then that sometimes becomes like the starting point.
Mm.
So either I think the stimuli can vary. Um, and I think also in terms of whether it's a poem or an essay or those things, again, it's also like what's feeling most natural in terms of, um, uh, something that I'm reading or consuming or something around me, or if it's, I think that as writers or all creative people tend to have consistent obsessions that sort of keep finding new forms
Mm.
um, over time. So I have my own bag of those, and then I have other stuff where I'm
Are there
like,
any specific examples you can share?
I think I've always been very interested in the act of creation, and it's something that I've followed a lot, even when I was writing both my theses. I mean, that was of course a very academic approach and a very philosophical approach to understanding this relationship between an author, a reader, and the text. And I'm not, really trying to dive into that or, prove my theory in my life or whatever. But um, I think that this inner world
Mm-hmm.
and the intensity of the inner world, how we relate to how the world is not how it is, it's how we are. That's a really, a popular phrase that I think we tend to come across in a lot of philosophy. And I really subscribe to that. And that's what fascinates me. And I think of creation as something that's done consistently, like creating an interaction, creating a moment. And there's that type of agency that really interests me.
Mm.
And then I kind of want to, explore what that looks like for different characters,
Mm.
or different emotions.
Mhm.
And then I like the idea of animating the world, like giving objects agency or slowing down time, like doing things that you can't necessarily do in real life. Like if you're having a great conversation, time will still pass, and then you'll be like, oh, I wish this conversation could have lasted 4 hours.
Mm.
And you can do that in a story if you want to. You can play with time. And I like, those are the things I like doing, giving someone an opportunity to have a great conversation for 4 hours. And a certain kind of reader would enjoy that, a patient reader, a sensitive reader. And sometimes someone might be like, oh my God, like it just went on for pages and pages and pages. Did she really need to do that? But I think that's the beauty of it. Like,
I don't know about the other conversations, but I'm feeling we're having a wholesome conversation,
yes,
Dipti.
we are.
Something pertinent and sensitive. Being a women author, do you how much responsible do you feel that your voice? Do you feel at all that way that your voice, um, the way you speak, the way you read, the way you write, has an impact on um, young women who want to? Who do you feel that way?
It's a complicated question, because I think that there was a point in time where there wasn't so much of a focus on the various intersections of your identity, right? And now we're living in a time where that focus is a lot more prevalent,
And I think it's
so.
an important area to focus on, right?
And it's a response also to like what's happening culturally, and just you're also a product of the times that you live in, and you're growing with those times. And of course, all those cultural influences play a big role. So for example, if I internationally being like a woman of color, an author of color, a lot of these different, and these intersections, of course, you can go as minuscule as you want and you can go as macro as you want. And it's not something that plays into my mind all the time.
Sure.
I'm not actively aware of it in that sense. And I don't mean to say it in a way where I'm not aware of the aspects of my identity that accord me a certain privilege to forget about it from time to time, because that's one side of it. And the other side is that, certain aspects are so implicit already in me that um, they're probably just naturalized into the way that um, I like deal with a certain kind of subject matter or whatever. So I feel like, for example, if someone had to, um, like, if I had to maybe I can go back in and analyze my work a certain way. Maybe there are different ways for me to, be responsible about.
It's not just about the times we live in. I mean, I was having this great conversation with my best friend. He lives in Atlanta. I spent um, almost a decade and a half living in the state of Georgia. Of late, there has been a lot of talk about Black Lives Matter, and and we were having this very interesting discussion. And I said, "Ben, all lives matter," and he said, "Yes, all lives matter, and Black Lives Matter." And then we started talking about gender. We started speaking about, um, and this conversation came up about, um, yes, or you write as a writer, and you don't really look at the reader's identity because anyone can go out there and buy a book and read the book. But I think that there are certain things which we felt was okay, but it's not okay, right? So I feel, and that was the point of me asking that question. How much does that add a sense of um, additional responsibility? Do you feel the pressure that because I'm a women author, I probably need to be, you know, um, need to have put my voice out there in a way which actually inspires a lot more.
I think that that's
I'm not sure if
no,
I hope.
I understand your question, but I don't think that that's
And that's totally your
yeah,
point of view. I mean,
it is. I mean, I'm, and I again, I don't feel comfortable speaking on behalf of large groups of people.
sure,
I
sure,
feel comfortable.
absolutely.
Yeah, I feel comfortable, representing myself, and that's why I was talking about intersections, because there are variations, there can be overlaps, and there are things that people might connect with you on. People might feel disconnected from another aspect of your identity, and I think that it's it's so much pressure, to to take on that responsibility. Am I a sensitive, responsible person? Yeah, yes. I trust those things about myself. I don't think, maybe if I was, someone who started writing 40, 50 years ago and now was trying to write something that felt more relevant, maybe then I would have to push through things in a certain way. But I'm growing up in this time. I've grown up in this time. I think that a certain degree of self-trust is important, and I trust those aspects of myself to know that I will choose to deal with something sensitively if I so choose to write about it. And in terms of I don't know, I'm uncomfortable with boxes. I don't necessarily want to be put in a box. I can understand how that helps curate reading lists and help people analyze things and say, I wonder if this lens is a great way to enter this work. And I'm all for that. That's the beauty of interpretation. That's why it's such a, open and varied discipline. But personally, I don't. I mean, I wouldn't. I don't. I don't feel that responsibility, and in a way, it's not because I don't care. I don't have important ideas about, or connect with the larger discourse. I do, but I I don't I don't feel the active pressure to do that. And of course, I think there's an aspect, there's an understanding that all our identities are political and all art is political. And but for me, that's a lens with which to see something. There are multiple lenses with which
Sure,
to see
sure,
something.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I completely agree. Okay, coming back to reading, writing. Any favorite authors growing up today? Any contemporary author who inspire you?
There's obviously a whole long list, and then
Mm.
it could start from from the likes of like Oscar Wilde to if I think about contemporary authors. In fact, I'm reading a lot of essayists recently. I just started this book by Ross Gay,
Mm-hmm.
and it's called The Book of Delights. It's delightful. It's basically him like chronicling a delightful moment over
Mm.
the course of a whole year in his life, especially as a response to the fact that the world feels so bleak right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading him right now, but I've noticed that off late I'm really enjoying reading essayists. Um, if I think about like other authors that I really like Zadie Smith a lot. I read a bunch of her books. I'm trying to think. This is always that question is that like I always feel like I should be prepared. You know, every morning I should wake up and be like, these are my 5 favorite authors, Dipti, don't forget. And then every time someone asks me, I'm like, I start to visualize my nightstand and think about the books that lived there.
Have you read this book, Normal People?
I have Sally Rooney. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you find her?
I think that I really do enjoy Irish writers.
Mm.
And I think that her book, I mean, I enjoyed it because I really like this whole nitty gritty of the interpersonal. I find the
Yes.
intimate to be a very charged space.
So I feel the way she writes, I just feel that she's not just as a reader. I feel as a writer, she's there. Like she feels those characters. So for me, Normal People is one of the most beautiful book I've read in recent times. Um, Chimamanda Ngozi is another of my favorite author. And there's this. So we had this literary read during Women's Day last year, and we had about 5 of us come down and read one book written by a women author. And I chose Chimamanda's book, where um, it's basically it's kind of an essay where she writes a letter to her friend, who asks her, "How do I raise my daughter
Is
as a
it We Should All
feminist?
Be Feminists? Is that the book?
How do we raise our daughter as a feminist?" And so it's like a 13 or 15 pointer where she says how you raise. And the way she defines feminism and the way she says how you raise, I just found that to be very wholesome in the way. These are some of the modern authors who, when I get to know that she's writing a new book, I get very inspired. I said, I have to just pick up a copy, you know? So yeah, coming back to your favorite contemporary authors.
I mean, your point about Sally Rooney is great, and I think that's something that you see in a lot of contemporary writing as well, right? Like um, the authentic writers are taking aspects of their lives, the negotiations that they're trying to make, whether it is you know being a part of a certain fabric, whether it's like you're more in you're either more in the mainstream or not in the mainstream, or whatever those negotiations might be for you. You see a lot of that as being the driving force behind contemporary literature, I feel. And for me, it's interesting to just see different. Uh, I'm drawn to the stories. I'm actually most drawn to voices, I would say, and that kind of helps me enter different worlds. And I mean, it's really hard. Like I like to read widely. I'm not I'm not someone who is like, okay, now I'm going to read only South American authors, or like I'm not. That's not the lens that I usually use. It's mostly like, okay, sometimes I'll enter a region or I'll enter a genre. Like maybe it could be like magical realism. Maybe that would be the entry point into that space. And it so happens that then I'm consuming a lot from that region. But just I think like even to your point about like, okay, like women or like reading women authors and stuff. And this is something that I encounter a lot in the art world as well, that it's a definition that's used for, female and so identifying artists, but you never say male artist. It's just a group of artists. And I think that that's something that it is. I understand it's problematic. It's like we're all artists, we're all writers. So I think even just jumping back a little bit to what we were discussing, I think that it's the labeling that's a bit overwhelming, and it's a bit
I do get that, Dipti, but I also feel that for it's coming back to the point of privilege. Today, I think we are at a stage where, at least in the large big cities, although I think there are still challenges out there, but everybody seems to be on a kind of an equal footing. But for a very long time, women and certain sections of the society did not, despite having the capabilities, were not able to express themselves the way they are. So I don't see that's problematic if we come forward and say women author, or whether it comes to gender or orientations, that in no way, takes away from them who they are.
No, I mean, I agree with you in one way, because I feel like it's not the act of naming or what the naming is.
Yes.
Sorry, it's not what the definition is.
Mm.
It's the need for definition, right? And I think that this is, also, I was having this conversation with a really great artist that I work with, and we were talking about identity politics, and
Mhm.
we were talking about what it was like in like the 80s, and what it's like now. And then he was actually drawing very interesting parallels between the two time periods, and he was talking about how the need for cultural markers or these identity based markers is so much more now versus a couple of decades ago. The idea of assimilation was the way to sort of create community, right? And now it's like there's more of a focus on um, the aspects of, just really leaning into all the aspects of you that define you.
Yeah, but I think when you talk about those assimilations, I think there were many sections who probably got just.
No, of course. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm just, and I feel like we are. I mean, I'm not trying to be disparaging. I actually feel like I was curious by your comment about whether you feel like in urban environments whether things are actually on an equal footing, because I just think that the mirage of that has been mastered at some level.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
it's creating that illusion that,
Mhm.
oh, okay, we're so much more progressive, but when you really start to unearth things, or when you hear local stories, or you know what's going on, you realize that there's an ideal version that helps everybody sleep at night, but the ideal version is not the reality that we're
Mhm.
living, which is why that conversation with this artist was so interesting to me, because
Mhm.
I mean, we're just having debates, right? Or like
Right.
we're just discussing ideas, um it was fascinating to me that there's such a cyclical aspect to identity politics, and how things that felt urgent then feel urgent now, versus suddenly for like some 40 years in the middle, maybe it wasn't as urgent. And those are the things that I find interesting about like how we're trying to, when we're talking about like how we identify who we are, how we connect with ourselves, and the kind of stories we want to tell.
I think the word politics or politics, that's being force fed.
Mm.
Identity, I think that's the focus area should be. We tend to bring in politics everywhere. I mean, I think it's just the way it is. um Poetry, and I have been.
Politics to poetry.
Yes, I and of course, historically, if you look at it, poetry has played a very important role
Mhm.
in making a difference. And I've the first few lines which I read as we introduced you in our show, um, especially this one about the eggs for breakfast, which was about how much of you is there in those lines when you talk about unpredictability of life, uh, the chaos, the confusion. How much of Dipti is there in those?
So this is an interesting example that you've pulled up, because in this poem, I was actually responding to a photograph by an artist, and in that photograph, there's a really young girl who is walking through, like she's walking through a forest, and it's just completely like it just looks like a very very wild and raw place. There's just like leaves and stuff everywhere. So uh, my response, I mean, I was thinking about I was sort of just thinking about what that girl might have done in the morning, or where she might be going, or where she might want to go. And I'm someone who starts her day off with breakfast. That's a very big part of my
Mhm.
morning. And I think those are the sorts of cues that when you ask, where are you in the poem? That's where I would say I came. I mean, those are those points where I feel like, okay, I can see myself there,
Mm.
right?
And breakfast being the sense of life.
But also just sort of being like some form of like it's like it's something that it's a pleasure of life that one wants to take for granted. Can everybody take that for granted? Can everybody take butter for granted? There's so many, like, wanting to take these moments. I mean, from my perspective, looking at something that I have access to so freely, and then imagining what it would be like to not have access to it so freely, and what meaning that could take on, what someone's life could be like if if it was a novelty. And then what else could that person want that could be a novelty that's not a novelty for someone else? And that's sort of what I was deriving from that picture, because, she seemed determined to me, but she also seemed sort of lost. And then she was standing right in the middle of the forest, and there was just literally, like, she could have gone in, like, circularly anywhere. There was just so much open space around her. Um, I was just, thinking, where does she want to go? And then, yeah.
I've read some of your interviews where you've spoken about a great support system around you growing up, encouraging you to pursue what you want to. But at any stage while choosing your career or different aspects of life, but that was that little girl in you in anywhere?
I mean, I would think that little girl must be in all of us, right? That sense of everything seeming very grand
Mm,
and larger than you. And there's a whole reason why people say when you know, spend time in nature, for other people it could be religion, for some people it's like the corpus of literature. It doesn't matter. Whatever you define your larger world to be,
mm,
if you confront it at some level, you are filled with this sense of awesomeness,
mm,
right? Like, you're filled with awe.
mm.
And I think that awe is terrifying and also very inspiring. And that usually is a combination of experience that we have when we're, trying to find the next step or the next 5 steps, or you're at, like, a crossroads, you're making a choice between something. There's a combination of those feelings when you're actually dealing with worthwhile choices. Um, so I feel like, of course, that little girl is in me as well.
You went into publishing, right? How was that experience?
It was good. It was really interesting for me to be on the other side
Mm,
of writing, and then I feel like it was a very uh, great confluence of business and writing, right?
mm,
So I feel like I found an opportunity to sort of work that side of my brain as well, which is why, like, even now in the art world, I'm able to understand the larger picture as well, in terms of, like, connecting with audiences, or, like, creating engagement. Like, I understand the need for those things, right? So, like we were discussing earlier about the ecosystem, there's a reason editors exist. There's a
mm.
reason there are curators and gallerists and so many different aspects of a creative world, because there's a symbiotic energy. In the best possible way, it all works towards the same goal, right?
So when a manuscript came to you, how often did the writer within you uh, stop you from chopping off or
It's
pushing back?
It's tough, because when you, like, when you're in an editorial capacity, like working in an editorial capacity, you have to find the best way to help someone else say the thing that they want to say. But you can't decide what that best way is. And that's quite challenging. And I feel like that's, I mean, I still kind of independently edit from time to time, but of course I don't do it full time anymore. And I think that's something that I imagine grows with experience. So when you have a really experienced editor, someone who off the bat is like, lose that, you're trying to say this, like that. I think that comes with experience, because you need to very actively train yourself to not rewrite it the way that you would like to read it. You're the first reader, and you have a lot more agency than other readers, of course, but you really have to work with the writer to get them to do to say what they're trying to say the
Any
best.
particular moment in your role as an editor where you felt like an aha moment, or this is
I think the moments that were really meaningful is when, you sort of flag something or you share an interpretation. And I'm one of those people that when I'm editing, I have like 1,000 comment boxes, but it's not like everything is like, oh, a critical comment. It's like
Hmm.
me conversing with the manuscript and the author. So sometimes I'll be like, haha, or like that was great, or I love that, or let's see more of that. So it's just it can be conversational, and I think that the moments where where you with someone responds saying that um oh, like I didn't see that, or like I think that might have been what I was trying to say, or that's the critical emotion in this scene versus this or something. I think those I think what I've really enjoyed have been those moments where um it felt like a partnership. I think that aha moment was really joyful for me. And when I if I step back into my head as a writer, I know that that's a relationship that I am seeking. So I think it helped me understand the kind of editor that I'm looking for, because I'm still looking to publish my first book. And it's a relationship that I want. I want, and it has to be with the right person, because it's an intimate one. And you want someone to understand what you're doing. But I've reached a point now where I'm like, I would love that input, and let's work on it together to really get it to where it needs to be.
So it was a short tenure as in the editorial role, right? I mean, like a couple of years.
It was a couple of years, yeah. I was with Penguin Random House for about a year and a half, and then I actually left because I wanted to work on my book full time. And I was at that point doing like independent editing projects, some with Penguin still, and some with other publishers. And then I sort of went into the art world maybe almost 4.5 years ago.
Moving into editing was a conscious choice. Was it because you were already contemplating to write your first book?
It was more that at that point I was thinking of confluences. It just felt like a great combination of business and writing. And at that time, I felt that it would be a great space for me to, it was connected enough to writing, where I felt that, um, for me, those connections are important. I don't know if I'm yet the kind of person who could do two very far off things. So that I think it felt like that. And then of course things just sort of worked out that way. And that's what helped me have that experience.
And now you are a curator at the Vadhera Art Gallery. And if I'm right, you also interned with them.
I did.
Yes.
I did. Many years ago, I was 19 when I interned with them.
The internship happened just randomly, or you really wanted to do
I
it?
wanted to spend some time just sort of figuring out, like I knew that, it was, I wanted to be in a creative world. I was just trying to figure out which world that would be, because of course things are connected, but each beast is its own. So I think, I think it was a couple of weeks, maybe a month or 6 weeks or something at that time.
And as a curator, you get to work with different artists, each having their own voice of expression. How much of those do you imbibe within you when you work with these different artists?
In the sense,
In the sense, their thoughts, their expressions, the way they look at the world. How much of that, or you try to detach yourself from and just purely look at yourself as a curator to market their work?
it's hard to be in the presence of so much stimulation and so many great ideas, and seeing such persuasive expressions of things that really matter to someone, and then not be influenced by it, right? And there was we were recently working with this really young artist from Sri Lanka, and um, like her work deals a lot with the Sri Lankan Civil War. And in that sense, there's a lot of contextual heaviness to her work, but there is such a palpable lightness about her as a person. She's, and the many days that we got to spend together in person together, I was just floored by that. I was so taken away with, she would, sit and be like, Dipti, can I tell you a joke? And I used to be like, please, like, I would love to, hear a joke. And her general demeanor was just so positive that sometimes I feel like, when you actually don't detach the artist from the art and you look at them both together, it's even more fascinating because you're like, okay, the art is, she's talking about, it's such a rich archive of something that was so important in the history of the country. And then when you spend time with her, you feel like, that's what a story of not, of overcoming looks like, and it's hard not to be inspired by that. It's hard not to kind of let that influence your perspective and then, look at how the connection that you maintain with your circumstances and where you're um, allowing yourself to be overrun, or where you're the one who's sort of, kind of saying, okay, no, like I need to have a better attitude about things.
It's interesting because the art and the artist, and the civil war in Sri Lanka, which is very recent, and what they went through. Was there a specific reason why you moved into being a curator, or was it just a natural flow? You said, I've done all of this. Let me just get into it. And I believe you're also a classical dance
No,
enthusiast.
I'm
Is this
not.
not, or was just liking?
No, I mean, I
Or
generally
did my research team get this wrong?
they may have over researched at a point of, yeah, but I mean, I generally am someone who enjoys cultural events and the arts in general. So I am happy, like, I'll enjoy the symphony, I'll enjoy the ballet. I'm not I wouldn't say I'm an enthusiast in that sense, but I'm very, very happy to engage with
Yeah.
the arts.
The note says enthusiast.
Is it? Okay.
Yes. So
we just dropped the classical dance from, yeah.
So getting back to curation. So was it just your, is it Dipti's way of looking at art in a holistic way? Do you intend to move beyond curating and into something else?
It was definitely natural progression. I think that, I had interned with the gallery before as well, and that's how they knew me. And it just so worked out that, they called me and they asked me, what I was up to and whether I would be interested in joining the gallery. And it just all sort of came together. And then I think that that is the beauty of flow, where sometimes you try something, then you move into another space and you kind of learn what's working well for you. And I think that only comes with experience. So yeah, it was natural progression.
There was something interesting I read up, Dipti. A lick of night in the morning, and I think this is something which you curated for an artist. And
It was a group show, so a bunch of artists.
Can you share something about it? Because when I read it, I felt like it's more about how our senses connect with art and how time plays a role.
So that is definitely a cornerstone of the curation, because I was very interested in the sensory response viewers would have when they would come and interact with the work. So whenever you have time and you kind of go, and if you want to go see some images from the exhibition, the works were very, very bold in and dealing with very intense questions, and presented in an intense manner. So the whole thing was definitely, there was a very palpable atmosphere.
I think in many ways, our senses and time plays a role in every aspect of our life. I mean, do you not agree to that? Dipti, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I mean it.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Before we wrap up this episode, for now, I'm hoping to have you back soon.
That would be lovely. Yeah.
Yeah. There are many poems which you've written, and some of them I've researched and found. But something which left a very profound impact on me is lungs. Right? It's just there is something about it which I can relate to, and I think a lot of people can. So if it's okay, if you would be so kind to read it out for us.
I would love to. It's a special poem for me as well, because it's something that I wrote a very long time ago, and it's.
Do you remember what made you write this, or?
I think the beginnings of the poem was a personal experience, and it just went through many iterations. I mean, like if I'm saying for 10 years, I think every year I must have re-peeked at it and moved things around. But it eventually
Was it
looks.
also because some things were changing in your life every year?
I think that when I look at old work and I try to, I look at it again, then like I'm an editor, right? I try and look at what was I trying to say then that I'm not saying well enough for it to have come through. And I think that was the approach that I had. I didn't want to deviate completely from what the original feeling was, but I'll read it.
Sure.
Lungs. The day we finally met, after not meeting, me, the butterfly with a quiet past, you, catchy like a tune, I recited an old story. Once I was barely here, mother's heartbeat held me, while doctor said I was a natural, while father called my to-be brains his. But I knew my birth had been a magic trick. Yours too, you are air. With you, I discovered how to breathe, dancing 12 steps in my tight, buttonless red dress, swaddling my body like saltwater prune skin, though underneath, in a hollow cavity, filling with a drunkenness. The air again, I suppose, full-bodied and heavy, moved inside me like a hurricane.
That's so beautifully written.
Thank you.
As I said, Dipti, absolute pleasure to have you.
Likewise, thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation
I
as
have,
much as I do.
yes.
I really do not know how to wrap up this episode, but I would just say that each one of us must keep the artist in us alive, the curiosity in us alive, and follow our passion and dream as we evolve as a human being. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening in. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you for listening to the Between Us podcast. This episode was recorded at Ferris Wheel Studio in Gurugram. Our sound engineers are Rohit Das and Mainak Chakraborty, and our producers are Santosh Kumar and Arnav Dogra. The video was processed by Viewfinder's Edit. Between Us uploads episodes weekly, and we'll see you next time.